Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving deep into the shadows that can stretch from even the brightest of loves. Imagine a warm evening, the scent of salt and jasmine in the air, the promise of a new life twinkling like distant stars. You feel safe, adored, maybe for the first time in a long time. But the hand you're holding is slowly, meticulously building a cage around you, and the bars are forged from affection and care. It's a chilling thought because this isn't a monster from a fairy tale. This is a story about a predator who wears the face of a perfect gentleman, a reminder that the most terrifying threats often whisper our name with a smile. You might not survive this kind of encounter with your spirit intact, so before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see our little community scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. Her name was Birgit, and she was not a naive woman. Let's get that straight from the jump. She wasn't some starry-eyed teenager looking for an adventure to post on TikTok. Birgit was 54 years old, a widow who had navigated the sharp edges of grief and come out the other side stronger, if a little more guarded. She was self-employed, ran her own small consulting business from a tidy office in her German home, and her life was a testament to her competence. It was a life that could function, and function well without romance. It was organized, it was planned, and it was secure. Birgit knew how to pay her taxes, how to fix a leaky faucet, and how to negotiate a contract. She was, in short, the kind of person you'd call to help you get your life together, not the other way around. My life is organized by a series of cascading sticky notes, so I'm already impressed. After her husband's death years prior, she had built a fortress of solitude, not an unhappy one, just a quiet one. It was a life of routine, of long friendships, like her bond with Petra, her closest friend since their university days. They were the kind of friends who could sit in comfortable silence or talk for hours, their history a warm blanket between them. But in the quiet moments, in the space between the day's last email and the first page of a book, a subtle loneliness had taken root, and that's where Ahmed came in. Their meeting was thoroughly modern, an online dating site catering to a more mature crowd. His profile was nice, not suspiciously perfect, just nice. A kind face, a few distinguished silver streaks at the temples, photos of him reading in a sun-drenched courtyard or smiling by the sea. No shirtless gym selfies or pictures of him holding a giant fish, thank goodness. He was 49, lived on the Tunisian island of Jerba, and his bio was disarmingly frank. He was a man of letters, he said, tired of superficiality, looking for a genuine connection. As the ancient scribes probably didn't say, but should have. Beware the man whose profile picture is too perfect, for his pixels may hide a multitude of sins. He was, from the very first message, charming, not in a slick, practiced way, but with a quiet, attentive grace. He was polite, well-read, and he asked questions about her life, her work, her thoughts. He seemed genuinely interested in the architecture of her soul. Their conversations, first through messages and then long video calls that stretched late into the night, became the highlight of her day. He spoke of his life in Jerba, an island steeped in history. Some even say it's the mythical land of the lotus eaters from Homer's Odyssey, a place where visitors would eat the lotus fruit and forget their homes, content to live in a state of blissful apathy. An ironic little piece of foreshadowing, if you ask me. Ahmed was a master of what psychologists sometimes call lovebombing. It's a contentious term, debated in academic circles for its lack of a strict clinical definition, but in the real world, it's all too recognizable. It's that initial overwhelming wave of affection, the constant communication, the grand declarations of love that make you feel like the center of the universe. For Birgit, who had been orbiting in her own quiet galaxy for so long, being pulled into his gravitational field felt like destiny. He made her feel seen. So, faster than Petra ever thought possible, Birgit booked a flight. She packed a suitcase for a 2-week vacation, probably throwing in an extra sweater and a good book, not realizing she was packing for the first chapter of a completely new life. Jerba was everything he had promised. The sun felt warmer, the sea bluer, the air thick with the scent of bougainvillea. Ahmed was the perfect host, the perfect partner. Their days were filled with gentle exploration, their nights with conversations that felt like coming home. The fortress around Birgit's heart didn't just crumble, it evaporated in the Mediterranean heat. It was during that first trip, as they sat on the terrace of a small cafe, that he brought it up. Not with pressure, but as a hopeful suggestion. "Why don't we find a small place together?" he'd asked, his hand covering hers. "A little nest for us." He framed it as a practical matter for two serious adults. For Birgit, it wasn't just a suggestion. It was an affirmation. It was a tangible blueprint for the future they had been building with words. She returned to Germany, but only to dismantle her old life. She informed her clients, sublet her home, and told Petra the news with a glow in her voice that was impossible to question. Her first few weeks in their new Jerba apartment were blissful. Her messages to Petra were filled with the joy of discovery. Photos of sunsets, descriptions of the local market, happy selfies with Ahmed. It was a storybook romance. But then, almost imperceptibly at first, the narrative began to change. The detailed, happy emails became shorter. The weekly calls became brief check-ins. A story that began as a vibrant, colorful epic was slowly, page by page, fading to gray. For a friendship that had spanned more than 30 years, the silence was deafening. At first, the change in Birgit's messages was subtle enough for Petra to dismiss. The long descriptive paragraphs about the sunlight hitting the whitewashed walls and the taste of fresh mint tea were replaced by shorter, more functional updates. "Having a lovely time. Hope you're well." Then came the missed calls. Petra would phone, full of news about a mutual friend or a funny story from work, and it would go straight to voicemail. The return text would come hours later. "So sorry, connection is terrible here, we'll try you tomorrow." But tomorrow never came. The excuses started to pile up, each one plausible on its own, but forming a troubling pattern when stacked together. The Wi-Fi was spotty, a classic excuse that's a bit hard to swallow in an era when you can get a 5G signal on Mount Everest. She was tired. She was busy setting up the new apartment. She had a headache. Petra, ever the patient friend, gave her space. New love is a powerful vortex. It sucks you in and scrambles your priorities. It's normal to be a little MIA when you're building a new life, but there's a difference between being blissfully in love and, say, being held in a secure facility by a rogue government. The line was getting blurry. Petra found herself rereading their old message threads, comparing the vibrant, funny woman from 3 months ago to the curt, distant stranger who now occupied that chat window. This wasn't the Birgit she knew. The Birgit she knew could juggle 3 clients and a broken dishwasher while planning a dinner party. Tired wasn't an excuse. It was a challenge she met with coffee and a to-do list. The excuses felt hollow, like lines fed to her. Petra began to experience a low-grade form of gaslighting by proxy. It's a term we hear a lot, and its precise meaning is often debated, but at its core, it's the act of manipulating someone into questioning their own sanity or perception of reality. Every time Petra voiced a gentle concern, "You just don't sound like yourself, Bea," the response was a form of dismissal that made her feel like the one who was overreacting. "Don't be silly, Petra. I've never been happier. You're worrying for nothing." It was a gentle but firm wall, and it made Petra question herself. Was she being a bad friend? Jealous, maybe? Was she unable to accept Birgit's happiness? This is where that little thing called intuition comes in. Scientists sometimes talk about the enteric nervous system, the second brain in our gut. It's a network of neurons that can process information and generate feelings, those gut feelings, independent of our conscious brain. Petra's gut was screaming. It wasn't a thought. It was a physical sensation, a cold dread that settled in her stomach every time she saw Birgit's name on her phone, only for the call to go unanswered. Even the ancient Romans knew to trust their instincts. A wise centurion could tell when a report from a distant outpost just didn't add up, even if all the words were technically in order. The breaking point came after 2 solid weeks of absolute silence, not just short texts. Nothing. Petra's calls went unanswered. Her messages, sent on 3 different platforms, remained undelivered. She even sent a classic old-school email which felt like the modern equivalent of sending a raven. No response. The vibrant, living connection that had been a constant in her life for decades had simply been severed. That's when Petra made her decision. She was done hesitating, done questioning herself. The fear of being an overbearing friend was finally eclipsed by the much larger, much darker fear of what might be happening to Birgit. She booked a flight to Jerba for the next day. As she packed a small bag, her mind raced. She remembered a conversation from months ago when Birgit had decided to move. She'd given Petra a spare key to the new apartment. "For emergencies," Birgit had said with a laugh. "You know, in case I lock myself out or you decide you need a spontaneous Tunisian vacation." Petra found the key in a small jewelry box, cold and heavy in her palm. It felt less like an invitation and more like a weapon, the only tool she had to breach the fortress of silence. The flight was an exercise in controlled panic. With every passing hour, the scenarios in her head grew more grim. Was Birgit sick? Had there been an accident? Or was it Ahmed, the charming, attentive man who had seemed too good to be true? Petra scrolled through his online profile again. It was still there, unchanged, a quiet literary man smiling in the sun. The hypocrisy of it made her feel sick. "My friends and I have a pact that if one of us goes silent for more than 48 hours, the others are legally obligated to assume we've been kidnapped and start making calls." Petra had waited 2 weeks. She landed in Jerba and took a taxi directly to the address Birgit had sent her months ago. The building was unremarkable, a simple 3-story apartment complex painted a faded shade of ochre. It looked normal. Children were playing in a nearby courtyard and the air smelled of dust and sea salt. Petra's heart was hammering against her ribs. She walked up the 2 flights of stairs, her footsteps echoing in the quiet stairwell. She stood before the plain wooden door, number 2B. For a moment she just stood there listening. There was no sound from within, no music, no television, no voices. Just a profound, unnerving stillness. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pulled out the key. It slid into the lock with a soft, metallic click. The sound was finite, irreversible. She turned it. The door swung inward on a pocket of dead, still air. It was the kind of silence that has weight, pressing in on your eardrums. All the curtains were drawn, and the weak afternoon light that managed to bleed through the cheap fabric was sickly and gray, illuminating dust motes dancing in the gloom. The place smelled stale, with an underlying chemical tang, like a doctor's waiting room that had lost all hope. There was no music, no TV, just the monotonous, low-frequency hum of the refrigerator. It's a sound you never notice until it's the only one left. A final, lonely proof that electricity, at least, was still flowing through the apartment. And there, on the sofa, was Birgit. She was a silhouette at first, but as Petra's eyes adjusted, the image sharpened into a nightmare. Birgit was just sitting there. Her shoulders were slumped forward in a way that spoke of total collapse, her face gaunt and hollowed out, the skin stretched tight over her cheekbones. A faded, oversized t-shirt hung from her frame as if even her clothes were too exhausted to hold on. The vibrant, capable woman Petra had known her entire adult life was gone. In her place was this ghost, this empty vessel. As Petra stepped into the room, Birgit slowly lifted her head. There was no surprise in her eyes, no shock, just a vast, terrifying emptiness. "Petra," she said, and the name was a barely audible puff of air. It was spoken like a question, as if she was trying to place the name, or perhaps even her own identity. Petra rushed to her side, kneeling on the floor and taking her friend's hands. They were icy cold, and her pulse, when Petra found it, was a faint, thready flutter. She looked like she was viewing the world through a thick pane of glass. "Birgit? What's wrong? What's happened to you?" Petra whispered, her voice cracking. Birgit didn't answer. Her gaze drifted past Petra through the wall to somewhere far away. While her heart was breaking, Petra's mind, thankfully, clicked into crisis mode. She left Birgit on the sofa and did a quick, methodical sweep of the small apartment. The place was unnervingly neat, no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no chaos. In fact, it was cleaner than my apartment has ever been, which, in this context, is profoundly creepy. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was something cold and calculated. This was a textbook case of what experts call coercive control. It's a pattern of behavior designed to dominate, isolate, and strip a person of their freedom, and it's a concept that's still being debated and defined in courtrooms around the world. Ahmed hadn't needed to use force. As the ancient general Sun Tzu wrote, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." In the bedroom, the bed was made with military precision, but the sheets were crisp and uncreased, as if no one had slept in them for days. And there on the nightstand was the first concrete piece of the puzzle. An array of small, unlabeled glass vials with droppers, some half empty. Next to them were several blister packs of tablets, some completely empty, others with pills haphazardly punched through the foil. Petra didn't recognize the medication, but she knew this wasn't right. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking, and began taking pictures of everything. The vials, the pills, Birgit on the sofa, the barred windows that she was only now truly noticing. Then she called the police. The arrival of the Tunisian authorities and paramedics was a sudden, jarring intrusion of noise and efficiency into the tomb-like silence. Birgit was gently but firmly escorted to a waiting ambulance. At the hospital, the initial diagnosis confirmed Petra's worst fears. She was severely underweight, dangerously dehydrated, and under the influence of a cocktail of potent sedatives, drugs that, the doctors confirmed, she could not have been administering to herself in that state.
And Ahmed, he was gone, vanished without a trace. Back at the apartment, which was now a sealed crime scene, the investigators began their work. While Petra sat at the hospital, holding her friend's unresponsive hand, the apartment began to tell its own silent story. The investigators were initially perplexed by the lack of physical evidence. Then one of them, a sharp-eyed veteran detective, noticed something odd. In the bedroom, a framed picture of a generic beach scene was hanging on the wall, but it was hung bizarrely high, just a few inches from the ceiling. It was completely out of place in the otherwise meticulously arranged room. Not exactly a choice an interior designer would make unless the goal was to give you neck pain. He stood on a chair and carefully lifted the frame off its hook. Behind it, flush with the wall and painted the same color, was a small, square panel. He pried it open with a pocket knife. Tucked inside the shallow cavity was a small black cube with a tiny, gleaming lens pointed directly at the bed. It was a fully wired spy camera, a live memory card slotted neatly into its side. A cold silence fell over the investigators in the room. This crime wasn't just about drugging and abandonment. This was about surveillance. This was about control on a level they were only just beginning to comprehend, and if there was one camera, there were probably more.
The discovery of that first camera behind the picture frame was like pulling on a loose thread that unraveled the entire tapestry of Ahmed's deception. If there was one, there were more. The investigators, now operating with a chilling new hypothesis, swept the apartment with electronic detection gear. They found a second miniature camera tucked into a bathroom air vent, its tiny lens peeking through the slats. A third was found wired into the base of a smoke detector in the hallway. The installation was professional, precise, and clearly planned long before Birgit ever moved in. He didn't learn these skills from a 5-minute YouTube tutorial. This was the work of someone with experience. The investigators secured the memory cards and began the grim task of reviewing the footage. It was hours upon hours of silent, voyeuristic horror. They saw Birgit, but not Birgit. They saw a woman moving through her own home in a stupor, her movements slow and repetitive. She would stand in the middle of the room for minutes on end, staring at nothing. She would walk to the kitchen, open the fridge, close it, and return to the living room, only to repeat the exact same sequence 10 minutes later. The timestamps on the files were mostly clustered between 10 p.m. and 4 a.m., times when she should have been sleeping. It wasn't the behavior of a sick person. It was the behavior of a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a cocktail of chemicals. This was a man who didn't just want to control his victim. He wanted to document it, to watch it, to study it. This raises disturbing questions about his motivation, touching on traits associated with psychopathy. We often think of psychopaths as crazed killers, but the more debated and perhaps more terrifying concept is the successful psychopath, an individual who lacks empathy, is manipulative and callous, but functions at a high level, often undetected in society. They are the charming CEO, the respected neighbor, the attentive lover. They are predators hidden in plain sight. The search of the apartment continued. In the back of a wardrobe, behind a stack of neatly folded linens, they found a small, locked metal box. A simple pry with a tool popped the cheap lock, and inside, the case against Ahmed blew wide open. There were several USB sticks, a cheap burner phone with no SIM card, and a notebook filled with handwritten entries in French. The notes weren't a diary. They were a ledger. Less, Dear Diary, more, Dear Future blackmail material. It was filled with initials, dates, numbers, and short cold observations about behavior. The handwriting was definitively not Birgit's. When the tech unit analyzed the USB sticks, they found more than just the video files from the apartment. They found a digital archive of his predation. There were scanned copies of passports, driver's licenses, and identity cards belonging to at least 2 other women. The names were run through international police databases, and suddenly old cold cases began to warm up. A file from Austria described a retired schoolteacher who, after a brief and intense relationship with a foreign man, reported episodes of confusion and memory loss. She told authorities she felt like she was losing her mind, that she would drink tea with him and then have no memory of the rest of the night. Her claims were dismissed due to a lack of evidence. She eventually stopped talking about it, silenced by shame. Another name matched a deceased woman in Switzerland. The official cause of death was heart failure, but a curious note in her medical records, made by a concerned doctor, stood out. Patient exhibits sudden onset of confusion and aphasia shortly after visits from a male acquaintance from abroad. All these disparate threads, these stories of quiet suffering from across Europe, were now weaving together, with Ahmed at the center. An international arrest warrant, what's known as an Interpol Red Notice, was issued. It's essentially a global alert sent to police forces worldwide to locate and provisionally arrest a person pending extradition. The charges were heavy: severe bodily harm, sexual exploitation under the influence of substances, and unlawful deprivation of liberty. Back in Tunisia, Birgit had slowly started speaking again, coaxed by a patient criminal psychologist. When she was asked to join the prosecution as a co-plaintiff, she hesitated. The shame was a heavy cloak. But then, looking at Petra, who hadn't left her side, she found a flicker of the old strength. "I don't want him to do it again," she said, her voice quiet but firm. For weeks, Ahmed was a ghost. Then, a blip on a screen. At a routine border control checkpoint on a dusty road south of Tunis, an officer ran the ID of a man waiting patiently to board a bus. The name was fake, but the system cross-referenced his biometric data, facial structure, fingerprints from the scanner with the Interpol database. It was a match. Ahmed B. The officers didn't move in right away. They watched him, this calm, unassuming man, and waited. As he stepped toward the bus, they approached. The moment he realized what was happening, his calm demeanor vanished. He whipped around and discharged a canister of pepper spray directly into one officer's face, but the second officer was faster. The takedown was swift and hard. Once in handcuffs, Ahmed didn't struggle further. He simply went silent. You can fake a name, you can fake a personality, but it's hard to fake your biometrics. Ahmed, the meticulous fox who knew all the traps, had finally been caught. With Ahmed in custody, it seemed like the story should be over. The monster was caught, the victim was safe, and the credits should roll. But Ahmed's silence in the back of that police car was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of patience. During a routine transfer from his holding cell, a moment of transit between 2 buildings, he broke that silence. He turned to the guard beside him, his expression unreadable, and said in a low, even voice, "I am not alone. I have people around me who know what to do at the right time." The guard noted it down, a standard procedure for any kind of inmate threat. Usually when a guy in handcuffs says he has friends, he's talking about his cellmate and a shared plan to hoard pudding cups, not a private military contractor on standby. 2 days later, Ahmed was being moved to a central judicial building for his first hearing. The security was serious. A secured transport van, 2 escort vehicles, and 5 armed officers in the van with him. It was a short 15-minute drive through the city. The convoy was just approaching the ramp to the courthouse complex when the world erupted, a brilliant white flash, followed by a concussive thump that blew out the windows of the van and sent the escort cars skidding. A stun grenade. Immediately, thick, acrid smoke filled the street, reducing visibility to 0. The attack was a masterpiece of violent efficiency. It lasted exactly 42 seconds. 5 masked figures swarmed out of a gray delivery van that had been parked innocuously on the roadside. They weren't there to kill, they were there to incapacitate. They moved with a discipline that spoke of extensive training, overwhelming the disoriented guards with targeted, brutal force. The van's reinforced doors were breached with a portable battering ram. Ahmed didn't have to be dragged out. He simply walked out of the ruined vehicle, stepping over the injured officers, and got into the gray van. By the time the first police reinforcements arrived, they were gone. The official report called it an interruption of transfer. Behind the scenes, it was a 5-alarm fire. This wasn't just a prison break, it was a paramilitary operation. Ahmed wasn't just a con man, he was an asset valuable enough to warrant this level of violence. The English poet John Donne wrote that no man is an island, and it was now terrifyingly clear that Ahmed was no island. He was a peninsula deeply connected to a dark and violent continent. This operation bore all the hallmarks of a professional extraction, requiring logistical planning, surveillance, and skilled operatives, things you don't just pick up on the weekend. The international manhunt was back on, but with a terrifying new dimension. The investigators were now dealing with what security experts might call a hybrid threat, an organization that blurs the lines between a criminal enterprise, a paramilitary unit, and something else entirely. Weeks later, they got a lead. A single 23-second ping from a new burner phone, its SIM card registered to one of Ahmed's known aliases, hit a cell tower near a derelict warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the capital. It was more than enough. A special operations team was assembled, this time with the understanding that they were not going after a lone wolf. They approached the sprawling, rusted warehouse in the pre-dawn darkness, moving with practiced silence, securing all exits before preparing for the breach. They were ready for a fight. They just didn't know the fight was a trap. As the point team forced open the main steel door, a secondary device hidden behind it detonated. It wasn't a high explosive, but an improvised directional charge packed with metal shrapnel. The blast tore through the entryway, collapsing part of the ceiling and taking the entire entry team down in a storm of heat and metal. None were killed, but every single one was critically injured. While the operation descended into a chaotic rescue mission, Ahmed and his group made their escape. They had created their own exit, a narrow path cut through the thin, corrugated metal wall at the back of the building, leading through an adjacent lot and out to an unmapped service road. Their exit strategy was a little more sophisticated than just running really fast. When backup units finally stormed the now empty building, they found almost nothing. Just an overturned cup, the remnants of a large cache of pharmaceuticals, and a single handwritten note stuck to the wall. In Arabic, it read, "You want to treat me like an isolated case, but I am not an isolated case." Ahmed was never seen again. Despite the ongoing international search, he has vanished. The prevailing theory now is that his manipulation of women wasn't just for personal sick gratification, but was part of a larger network involved in drug trafficking, smuggling, and intelligence, using compromised individuals as unwitting mules or information sources. And the most chilling suspicion, the one that keeps investigators awake at night, is the very real possibility of a mole within the authorities. Someone on the inside playing for the wrong team, erasing data and closing doors just as the police got close. Birgit lives a quiet life now, back in a small town in northern Germany. She is under legal protection and continues with therapy. She doesn't give interviews. Her story became public through the court proceedings, a life turned inside out for the world to see. But her own words given in a witness statement remain the most powerful epitaph for this ordeal. When asked to describe what Ahmed did to her, she didn't speak of violence or fear. She said, "He didn't scream, not once. He didn't hit. He just started to make me quieter." Sometimes the most profound violence isn't a bang, but a slow, deliberate fading into silence orchestrated by a monster who knows that the most effective cage has no bars at all. And so, the story of Birgit and Ahmed doesn't truly end. It simply fades into an unsettling quiet, leaving us with the chilling knowledge that the man at the center of the storm is still out there, a ghost in a global machine that is far larger and more terrifying than we can fully comprehend. The questions left in the wake of his escape are profound, touching on the very nature of a hidden world that operates with its own rules, just beneath the surface of our own. It forces us to reconsider our notions of safety, and to acknowledge that sometimes the systems we build to protect us are no match for the meticulous planning of those who wish us harm. For Birgit, and for